Every year, a stranger left $88,888 in my mailbox on my birthday. This went on for 20 years. I never saw his face. But one day, instead of money, I found a note. It's time for you to know the truth. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I was 44 years old when everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be a carefully constructed lie. But I should start earlier than that. I should start the way all stories about ordinary women begin, with an ordinary morning, coffee going cold on the counter, and the quiet certainty that today would look exactly like yesterday. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I grew up in Millbrook, Connecticut, in a pale yellow house on Ardmore Street that my mother, Carol Mitchell, rented for 31 years without ever once being late on the payment. My mother was a bookkeeper for a regional insurance firm. She was precise, punctual, and private in the way that certain women of her generation were. Not cold, exactly, but sealed. She kept her inner life folded up somewhere you couldn't easily reach. I admired that about her when I was young. Later, I understood it differently. She died when I was 23, a stroke that came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon in February. I was living in New Haven by then, working as an office administrator for an architectural firm, and I drove the 40 minutes to Millbrook in weather so bad the highway signs were invisible. She was already gone by the time I arrived at Hartford Hospital. I had no siblings, no aunts or uncles I'd ever met. My father, according to my birth certificate, was listed as unknown. So I was alone in the way that some people are alone. Not dramatically, not tragically, but structurally. The scaffolding that holds most people up simply wasn't there. I went back to Millbrook after the funeral. I settled my mother's modest estate. I found $1,700 in her checking account and a savings account with just under $4,000. I packed her clothes and her kitchen things. And then, on the morning of my 24th birthday, March 12th, I walked down the front path to collect the mail and found an envelope in the box. It was a plain white envelope, no return address. My name written in careful block letters, Sarah Mitchell. Inside was a stack of $100 bills, held together with a rubber band. I counted them 3 times, standing in the thin March sunlight on the front step. $800 and $8,800 bills. $88,800. I stood there for a long time. My first thought was that it was a mistake. My second thought was that my mother had arranged it somehow, that this was some posthumous gift from an insurance policy I hadn't known about. My third thought was that I should call the police. I did none of those things. I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the money until the coffee finished brewing. I never called the police. I told myself I'd figure out where it came from. I never did, not that year. I deposited it gradually in small increments at 3 different banks, the way a person does when they are frightened of a good thing and don't want it taken away. The next year, on March 12th, there was another envelope, same handwriting, same amount. By the 4th year, I had stopped questioning it the way you stop questioning the sun rising. It was simply a fact of my life. Every birthday, the envelope. I built my existence carefully around it, not recklessly, not extravagantly. I used the first several payments to put myself through night school, then a proper college degree at the University of Hartford. By my mid-30s, I was a licensed CPA with a small but steady practice in West Hartford. I owned my own home. I drove a sensible car. I had a good life, a careful life, one that I'd constructed almost entirely on my own. Almost. I had one rule I kept without ever articulating it. I would not investigate the money. I told myself this was pragmatism. Looking back now, I think it was fear. Fear that if I pulled the thread, everything I'd built would unravel. I kept the envelopes in a shoebox in the back of my closet, 20 of them by the time I turned 43. I never showed them to anyone. Not to my colleague and closest friend, Diane Ostrowski, who knew almost everything else about my life. Not to my former therapist, no one. That was my ordinary life, and I was, in a muted, careful way, content with it. The first strange thing happened 6 weeks before my 44th birthday. A dark blue sedan was parked across from my house on 3 consecutive mornings. A Lexus, newer model, Connecticut plates. I noticed it the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit, the way a misaligned picture frame catches your eye. On the 3rd morning, I stood at my front window long enough to see a man sitting in the driver's seat. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't reading. He was simply watching the house. By the time I thought to take down the plate number, he was gone. I told myself it was nothing. A real estate surveyor, maybe. Someone waiting for a neighbor. I am a practical woman. I do not invent drama. But the second strange thing was harder to dismiss. In early February, I received a piece of mail that had been opened and resealed. Not well, just barely. The flap lifted and pressed back down with a thumb. It was a credit card statement, nothing sensitive, but the fact of it sat uneasily in my mind. Who would open a credit card statement? Why? March 12th arrived the way it always did, with cold air and the smell of thaw just underneath the cold, the particular scent of a Connecticut winter beginning its slow retreat. I walked down to the mailbox in my coat and boots. My heart did the small, involuntary thing it always did on this morning, a mixture of anticipation and guilt that I'd never quite been able to fully separate. I opened the mailbox. There was no envelope. There was only a single index card, folded once, my name on the outside in those same careful block letters I'd been seeing for 20 years. I unfolded it with numb fingers. It's time for you to know the truth. That was all. 7 words. No signature, no phone number, no indication of what truth, whose truth, or why now after 20 years of silence. I stood at the end of my driveway for a long time. The street was empty. The blue Lexus was not there. A crow landed on a neighbor's fence post, regarded me with its flat black eye, and flew away. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table, and my whole ordinary, careful, constructed life began, very quietly, to shake. For 3 days, I didn't do anything. That is perhaps the most honest thing I can tell you about myself in those first 72 hours. I sat with the index card on my kitchen table, and I did nothing. I went to work. I reviewed tax filings. I answered emails. I ate dinner alone in my kitchen and watched the card from across the room the way you watch an animal that might or might not be dangerous. On the second night, I called Diane, but I didn't tell her about the card. We talked for an hour about her daughter's college applications, her husband's bad knee, a client of mine we'd laughed about before. When I hung up, the kitchen was very quiet and the card was still there. By the 3rd day, I began to let myself think clearly. 20 years, 20 envelopes, $1,777,600. I'd done the math more times than I could count, lying awake in the small hours. Someone had been sending me that money since the week after my mother's funeral. Since I was 23 years old, broke, alone, and freshly bereaved. Someone who knew my mother. Someone who knew my name, my address, and my birthday with perfect precision, year after year, even as I moved twice and eventually bought my house on Whitmore Lane. Someone who, for reasons I had spent 20 years refusing to examine, had felt obligated to support me. The word obligated landed in my chest with a particular weight. My birth certificate said father, unknown. My mother had never, not once, answered a single question about my father. When I was 8, she told me he was gone. When I was 12 and more persistent, she told me it didn't matter. When I was 19 and angry about it in the way teenagers get angry about unresolved things, she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that was equal parts sorrow and calculation. And she said, "Some things are protected by silence, Sarah. You'll understand when you're older." I was 44 years old. I was older. I picked up the index card and turned it over in my hands. The handwriting was not the same as the envelopes. The block letters were the same style, careful, deliberate. But something in the pressure of the pen, the slight forward lean of the letters, was different. Whoever wrote this card had not written the envelopes, or had written them differently, under different circumstances, under perhaps duress. That was the thought that broke the dam. What if whoever sent the card was not the same person who sent the money? What if the note was a warning? I went to my office and began going through my files, not my client files, my personal files, the shoebox from the closet. I laid all 20 envelopes on the dining room table in a row, 24 years of birthdays, and examined the handwriting closely for the first time, with actual attention. The lettering was consistent, strikingly so, across all 20. Same pen pressure, same slight backward lean, same method of folding the bills. One person for 20 years. The index card was someone else entirely. That night, I sat down with a legal pad and wrote out everything I knew in point form, the way I organize a complicated tax case: facts, questions, inferences. The list of facts was short. The list of questions was long. The most important question was at the bottom, underlined twice. Who knew my father's identity, and why did they decide now was the time to tell me? My plan came together over the following week in the methodical way that plans do when you are a person who works with numbers and evidence for a living. I was not going to panic. I was not going to confront anyone blindly. I was going to collect information first, and I was going to do it without alerting anyone to what I was doing. Step 1. Find the best private investigator in Hartford County. I'd had exactly one client in 15 years of practice who'd used a PI, a woman going through a contentious divorce, and she'd mentioned a name, Frank Russo, formerly Hartford PD, now independent, discreet, not cheap. Step 2. Pull every document related to my mother that I still had. Her death certificate, the estate papers, any correspondence I'd kept, her old address book. Step 3. Go through every detail of those envelopes, postmarks, paper type. Anything a forensic analysis might tell me that 20 years of willful ignorance had prevented me from seeing. I found my mother's old address book in a box I'd stored in the basement, a small green address book with a cracked spine, the pages soft with age. I hadn't opened it since I'd packed up her house. Most of the entries were exactly what you'd expect: neighbors, her doctor, her dentist, the insurance firm, old colleagues. But on the very last page, in the inside back cover, there was a single entry written in pencil and then partially erased. The pencil impression was still there. I held it under a desk lamp at an angle until I could make out the letters. R. Harlow, 8605550147. R. Harlow. The number was 30 years old at minimum, certainly defunct. But the name, 2 words, felt like the first real thing I had found. I wrote it on my legal pad in large letters and stared at it for a long time. Was this him? Was this the person who had put money in my mailbox for 20 years? Was this my father? The fear I felt in that moment was not simple. It was layered. Fear of being wrong, fear of being right, fear of what being right would mean. I had lived my whole adult life on money I'd never questioned. What did it mean if that money came from a father who had never once shown his face, who had considered a rubber-banded stack of cash an adequate substitute for presents? I closed the address book. I made an appointment with Frank Russo for the following Thursday. Whatever the truth was, I was going to find it. I had spent 20 years not asking questions. I was done with that. Frank Russo's office was on the second floor of a brick building in downtown Hartford, above a Portuguese bakery. The smell of custard pastries followed me up the stairs. His waiting room had 2 chairs and a dead plant on the windowsill that no one had apparently thought to remove. He was a heavy-set man in his early 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent years listening to people tell him things they were embarrassed about. I liked him immediately. He didn't perform sympathy. He just listened. I told him everything. The envelopes, the 20 years, the card, the name in the address book. I laid the index card on his desk in a Ziploc bag I'd had the presence of mind to use from the beginning. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. R. Harlow, he repeated. You said Hartford area code. You run the name yourself? I searched online. There are several Harlows in Connecticut. One business listing stood out. Harlow Development Group, commercial real estate based in Simsbury. Founded in 1987, the principal listed is a Richard Harlow. Frank took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk. Richard Harlow. I know that name. The air in the room changed. He passed away, Frank said. 9 months ago. Fairly significant figure in commercial real estate in this state. Left behind a wife, Margaret, and a son, Derek, who took over the business. Estate was reportedly substantial. We're talking north of 40 million. I heard the number and felt nothing, which told me my brain was protecting me. When did he die? I asked. October. Last October. October. 5 months before my birthday. 5 months before the money stopped and the note appeared. The timeline snapped into place like a key in a lock. Whoever sent the note had waited until after Richard Harlow's death to make contact. Or, and this thought was colder, someone in Richard Harlow's family had sent it, now that he wasn't alive, to stop them. Frank took the case. His fee was reasonable, and his terms were clear. He would find what documentation existed to support or refute a biological connection between me and Richard Harlow. He would do so without approaching any member of the Harlow family directly. What he found over the following 2 weeks came back to me in a manila folder that I opened at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee I forgot to drink. Richard James Harlow had been born in 1951 in Hartford. He had attended the University of Connecticut and then Wharton for his MBA. He had married Margaret Elaine Pryor in 1978. They had one son, Derek, born in 1982. By all accounts, the marriage was the kind that operates more as a business arrangement than a romance. Functional, public-facing, cold beneath the surface. And in 1979, the year before Derek was born, Richard Harlow had been involved in a relationship with a woman named Carol Ann Mitchell, a bookkeeper he'd met through a professional contact. The relationship had lasted approximately 14 months. Carol Ann Mitchell, my mother. Frank had found this through property records, a Simsbury apartment that Richard Harlow had leased under a company name during that period. cross-referenced with my mother's employment records from that era, which placed her working for a firm with Harlow Development as a client. He'd also found a photograph, a photocopy, blurry, from a company Christmas party in 1979, the kind of group photograph that ends up in local business newsletters. Richard Harlow stood near the back. My mother stood 3 people to his left, and they were not looking at each other. But Frank had circled something in the margin with a red pen. In the photograph, my mother's left hand, partially visible, rested at a particular angle. She was, by the timeline, approximately 4 months pregnant. With me. I sat with the photograph for a very long time. Then I turned the page. The last item in the folder was a note Frank had clipped to the back, handwritten. The Harlow family retained a law firm in Hartford, Stanton and Webb, immediately following Richard's death. Their specialty, estate litigation and asset protection. Based on the timing and scope of engagement, my contact at the courthouse believes a trust dispute may be incoming. Be aware. If you intend to pursue any claim, you should move carefully. These are people with resources. I put the folder down. I looked out my kitchen window at the bare March garden. These people, Margaret and Derek Harlow, had resources, a law firm on retainer, and presumably a great deal of motivation to ensure that an illegitimate daughter nobody had officially acknowledged did not surface to complicate a $40 million estate. The note in my mailbox, "It's time for you to know the truth." Had that been Richard's doing? Something arranged before he died? A final act of conscience? Or had it been Derek's? Not compassion at all, but provocation. A way of drawing me out, identifying me, seeing what I intended to do so they could counter it? I didn't know yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty, sitting there in my kitchen in the gray March light. This was no longer about money. It never really had been. It was about who I was, and I was not going to let anyone take that from me. My attorney's name was Thomas Chen. He was 39, Harvard Law, and had built a practice in Hartford focused on estate law and probate litigation. Diane had recommended him when she dealt with her own father's estate 2 years earlier. He was precise in the way I valued. No wasted words, no performed optimism. I laid the entire story out for him in one sitting. 2 hours. He took notes by hand, which I respected. When I finished, he put his pen down and was quiet for a moment. "You understand," he said, "that posthumous paternity claims in Connecticut are legally possible, but procedurally complex. We would need DNA evidence. His is likely obtainable through the probate process if we can demonstrate standing. You would need to petition the probate court for the right to participate in the estate proceedings as a potential heir. That motion, once filed, becomes a matter of public record, meaning the Harlow family will know. Immediately, yes. I had expected that. What's our first move? We file a motion in Hartford Probate Court to open an inquiry into your potential status as an intestate heir of Richard James Harlow. We attach the documentation your investigator gathered as supporting evidence. We request DNA testing from the estate. The moment we file, the clock starts. We filed on a Wednesday. By Friday, I knew they'd been notified because on Saturday morning, Derek Harlow called my cell phone. I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't pick up. "Ms. Mitchell." His voice was even, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to business negotiations. "I think we should talk." "I agree," I said. "Have your attorney contact mine." "I'm not calling as a legal matter. I'm calling as a pause, as a concerned party. Everything related to this matter goes through counsel, Mr. Harlow." A longer pause. When he spoke again, the evenness had developed a fine crack in it. "You don't know what you're doing. My father was a private man. My mother is 67 years old. What you're about to put her through." "Your father sent me money for 20 years, I said. "I didn't ask for it. I didn't ask for any of this. Someone sent me a note telling me it was time for me to know the truth. I'm simply following that instruction." He hung up. 3 days later, a woman rang my doorbell at 7 in the evening. I didn't know her, but something about the quality of her suit and the way she stood told me she hadn't come by accident. She handed me an envelope without introducing herself. Inside was a single printed page, not on legal letterhead, deliberately so. It read, "The matter you have initiated will be contested at every stage. Evidence you believe to be credible will be challenged. The process will be lengthy, expensive, and public. Consider carefully whether the personal cost is worth pursuing. There are other arrangements possible." There was no signature. I photographed the letter, forwarded it to Thomas, and texted Frank. They made contact. Extra discretion going forward. Frank's reply came in 2 minutes. "Understood. Also, someone ran your plate in the Stop and Shop lot Tuesday. DMV lookup. I'll find out who." I stood in my hallway after I read that, and for the first time since finding the index card, I felt the full weight of what I was up against. These were not ordinary people protecting ordinary things. They were wealthy, organized, and apparently willing to conduct low-level surveillance on a woman who had done nothing except try to understand where she came from. The fear was cold and specific. It sat in my sternum like a stone. I called Thomas and told him about the letter. He was not alarmed in the clinical sense, but his voice sharpened. "That letter is potential evidence of intimidation," he said. "We'll add it to the file. Don't respond to them directly under any circumstances. Don't meet with them. Don't let them into your home." They said there are other arrangements possible. "They mean money," Thomas said. "They want to buy your silence. We are not selling." I said, "No, we are not." After I hung up, I sat on my front porch for a while, even though it was cold. The street was quiet. No blue Lexus. Just the ordinary sounds of my neighborhood settling into evening. A dog barking somewhere, a child being called inside for dinner, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. I thought about the 23-year-old version of myself, standing at this same mailbox with that first envelope, counting $100 bills in the March sunlight. She had been so alone. She had been so frightened of losing even this strange, anonymous lifeline. And she had built, very carefully, a life that no one could take away. No one was going to take it away now either. But this time, I wasn't going to do it alone, and I wasn't going to do it in silence. I gave myself 4 days. 4 days to rest, to breathe, to be afraid in private, and then be done with the fear. On the 5th day, I went back to work. Derek Harlow made his first real move 11 days after the probate petition was filed. He did it through an intermediary, a man I later confirmed was a financial consultant with ties to Harlow Development, a man named Gary Aldrich, who presented himself as a neutral party interested in exploring resolution options. He called Thomas's office. Thomas called me. "They're proposing a settlement," Thomas said, and I could hear the careful neutrality in his voice, the way a doctor gives you a serious diagnosis without letting his own opinion color it before you've had a chance to absorb the information. $2 million, confidentiality agreement. You acknowledge no biological relationship and make no further claims against the estate. $2 million. The number was large and deliberately so, large enough to look generous, large enough to make a practical, financially literate woman do the math. After taxes, after legal fees, still transformative. I'd spent 20 years being practical. I knew what the number represented. I also knew what accepting it would mean. It would mean that Richard Harlow had been allowed, in death, to do what he'd done in life, to keep me folded away, invisible, a private obligation managed quietly and never acknowledged. "Tell them no," I said. "Sarah, I want you to think about this for—" "I've thought about it, Thomas. The answer is no. The answer will remain no regardless of what number they attach to the offer." There was a brief pause. "All right," he said, and I heard something in his voice that might have been respect. "I'll communicate that." What I felt after I hung up was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated, a kind of stillness, the way the air feels after a decision has been made that cannot be unmade. I had been offered a version of comfort, and I had turned it away, and the clarity of that felt clean. That evening, I drove to Diane's house. I'd been keeping this from her for 6 weeks, which was, for us, an extraordinary concealment. We'd been friends since our early 30s, when we'd met in a continuing education course at UConn Hartford. She was a high school guidance counselor, and she had the particular gift of people in her profession. She could listen to something painful without needing to immediately fix it. I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything, from the beginning. The envelopes, the 20 years, the note, Frank's findings, Thomas's filing, the settlement offer I'd just refused. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Her coffee went cold. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been carrying this alone?" she said. 6 weeks of this, 20 years of the other part." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "Okay," she said. "What do you need?" That was Diane. "Not are you sure about this?" "Not $2 million, Sarah. Just, what do you need?" I told her I needed someone who knew the full picture, someone who could check in on me, who I didn't have to perform strength for, someone who knew where I kept the folder of evidence in case anything happened, and I needed someone to act on my behalf. She nodded. "You have that. You've always had that." Over the next 10 days, with Diane's steady, quiet presence behind me, I built the second layer of my case. Thomas had engaged a forensic genealogist who was working through probate records and biological databases. Frank had identified the woman who had delivered the intimidating letter. A junior associate at Stanton & Webb, Harlow's law firm, apparently tasked with the delivery to keep it off official channels. That was documented and filed, and Frank had found something else. Among Richard Harlow's personal papers, filed as part of the probate inventory, was a document that Stanton & Webb had apparently not thought to fully suppress. A handwritten letter, dated October 3rd, 2 weeks before Richard died, addressed to a Hartford law firm that was not Stanton & Webb. A letter in which Richard Harlow requested information about the proper legal process for formally acknowledging a non-marital child. He'd been trying to tell me himself. He had died before he could. And someone, Derek, almost certainly, had found that letter and decided to send me the index card instead. Not as an act of kindness, as a tactic. Draw me out, identify me, assess the threat level, manage it. They had miscalculated what kind of person I was. They came to my house on a Sunday. I saw the car first, a black Range Rover, not the blue Lexus, pulling up to the curb in front of my house at 11 in the morning. I was at the window with my coffee, and I watched Derek Harlow step out of the passenger side. He was tall, well-dressed, with his father's coloring and none of whatever warmth Richard might have had. Beside him, from the driver's side, stepped a woman I recognized from the photograph Frank had provided, Margaret Harlow. 67 years old, silver hair, the composed posture of a woman who has spent decades being photographed at charity galas. I called Thomas. He picked up on the second ring. "Derek and Margaret Harlow are in front of my house," I said. "They didn't call. They didn't arrange this through you." "Do not let them in," he said immediately. "I know." I watched them walking up my front path. "I'm going to speak to them from the doorway. I'll record it." I set my phone to record, tucked it in my cardigan pocket, and opened the front door before they knocked. "Mrs. Harlow, Mr. Harlow." I kept my voice level and my hand on the door frame. I did not invite them in. This is a significant departure from proper procedure. Margaret spoke first, and her voice surprised me. Softer than I expected, with a faint tremor that might have been age or might have been nerves. "Ms. Mitchell, I know this isn't the right way to do this. I asked Derek to bring me. I wanted to see you." She paused. "I wanted to see if we could handle this as a family." As a family. The word landed strangely. "We're not a family," I said. "No," she agreed, "but we might be in a legal sense soon." And I thought, I'd hoped, that perhaps there was a way to resolve this that didn't require destroying everything. She looked at me steadily. Her eyes were dry and intelligent. "You seem like a sensible woman, Ms. Mitchell. Surely you understand that litigation of this kind will take years. It will cost you enormously in legal fees. It will expose details of your mother's life that were private. Details," she said with a slight emphasis, "that were not entirely flattering to her." There it was, the soft landing for the knife. Your mother had an affair with a married man. How do you want that aired in public? Derek hadn't spoken. He stood slightly behind his mother with his arms crossed, watching me with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite succeeding. He looked like a man who had been told this would go one way and was becoming aware it might go another. "Mrs. Harlow," I said, "I have a great deal of respect for whatever you personally went through in your marriage. That wasn't your fault, and I don't hold it against you. But what you're describing, a quiet settlement, discretion, no public exposure, that's not something you're offering me out of kindness. That's something you're offering because a probate court finding that Richard Harlow had a living biological child would affect the distribution of an estate worth over $40 million. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "My mother kept that secret for 23 years, I continued. "She kept it because someone asked her to, because arrangements were made, because silence was the price of the only support she was offered. She died having never been acknowledged. I'm not interested in continuing that tradition." Derek spoke then, and his voice had lost all of its earlier control. "You're making a mistake," he said, and now the anger was audible, just beneath the surface. "You have a comfortable life. You built that life, fine, congratulations. Nobody disputes that. But if you push this, if you drag this into court and it comes out that you've been receiving unreported cash income for 20 years, there are tax implications that could be extremely—" "Derek." Margaret said his name quietly, but with a weight that silenced him. I looked at him. "Mr. Harlow, I am a licensed CPA. I have had tax counsel review my situation. I am not concerned about my tax exposure. But I would caution you very carefully about the difference between legal strategy and criminal threat." He stared at me. His jaw tightened. "I think you should go now," I said. They went. Margaret walked back down the path with her back very straight and her face composed. Derek followed, and at the car he turned and looked at me one more time, a look that I recognized, a man recalculating. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway and let myself shake for exactly 90 seconds. Then I took a breath, called Thomas, and played him the recording. "That'll be useful," he said. And then, for the first time since I'd hired him, "Sarah, I think we're going to win this." The fear didn't go away, but it changed texture. It became something I could use. The probate court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late May. Thomas had requested a DNA test through the probate inventory process, and after 6 weeks of legal wrangling, during which Stanton and Webb filed 3 separate motions to block it, all denied Boers. A sample from Richard Harlow's preserved biological material was obtained through the medical examiner's office. My own sample had been submitted weeks earlier. The result came back on a Tuesday, 2 days before the hearing. Thomas called me at 8 in the morning. 99.8% probability of paternity, he said. It's conclusive. I sat down. My kitchen was very bright in the May morning light, the windows full of the kind of green that only comes in Connecticut in late spring, extravagant and brief. I had known intellectually for months that this was almost certainly true, but the number, the cold, precise scientific confirmation, was something else entirely. "All right," I said, "we go Thursday." The hearing was held in a Hartford courtroom that smelled of old wood and recycled air. Thomas was beside me. Frank sat in the gallery as a courtesy. Diane sat 3 rows back. I had asked her to come, and I was glad she was there. Margaret Harlow was not present. Derek was, flanked by 2 attorneys from Stanton and Webb, both of them visibly expensive. What I remember most clearly about that morning is not the legal arguments. Thomas had prepared those meticulously and executed them without drama. What I remember is Derek Harlow's face as the DNA result was formally entered into the record. He had known it was coming. Of course he had. His attorneys had received it simultaneously with ours. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and having it read aloud in a court of law, in a room with a judge and a court reporter, and a public record that will exist indefinitely. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession. First, a tightening around the jaw, the look of a man suppressing a physical reaction. Then, something I can only describe as a recalibration, a rapid internal rearrangement of strategy. Then, a look he directed at me across the room, not quite fury, not quite contempt, but something in between. I looked back at him steadily. One of his attorneys, the senior one, a man named Garvey, asked to address the court. The judge allowed it. Garvey spoke for 12 minutes, very fluently, raising technical objections about the admissibility of the DNA methodology, the chain of custody of the biological sample, the legal standing of the petition itself, given the nature of the alleged relationship. He was skilled. He made his case calmly and with authority. When he finished, Thomas stood up. He spoke for 7 minutes. He entered into evidence, the DNA result, the 20-year history of payments documented through bank records, Richard Harlow's handwritten letter requesting information about legally acknowledging a non-marital child, the forensic genealogist's corroborating documentation, and, with the judge's permission, the recorded conversation from my front doorstep in which Derek Harlow had made what Thomas characterized carefully and precisely as a veiled reference to potential legal consequences designed to discourage a legitimate legal claim. The judge listened to approximately 4 minutes of the recording before stopping it. She looked over her glasses at the Stanton and Webb table. Derek Harlow's senior attorney was writing rapidly on a legal pad. Derek himself had gone very still. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, named the Honorable Patricia Souza. She had the manner of someone who has spent decades distinguishing between legitimate legal complexity and people using the legal system as a cudgel. She asked Garvey 3 questions. His answers were technically correct, but, and I watched this happen in real time, insufficient. The technical scaffolding he'd built couldn't carry the weight of the actual facts. Judge Souza set down her pen. The court finds sufficient grounds to proceed with the petitioner's claim, she said. The DNA evidence is admitted. The petition is validated. This matter will advance to full probate proceedings. Additionally, the court is referring the recorded communication to the Ethics Committee for review. Garvey said something quietly to Derek. Derek did not look at me again. I sat in my chair and breathed. Outside the courtroom in the marble hallway, Thomas shook my hand. Diane hugged me hard enough that I had to laugh. Frank, walking past, gave me a single nod. The professional economy of a man who'd seen this kind of thing before and recognized what it cost. On the drive home, I didn't play the radio. I drove in silence, through the May afternoon, past the green fields and the white churches and the ordinary Connecticut towns that had been the backdrop of my whole ordinary life. And I thought about my mother, sitting alone in the pale yellow house on Ardmore Street, keeping a secret that was never hers, alone to keep. I'm sorry it took me this long, I thought, but I got there. The full probate proceedings lasted 4 months. Stanton and Webb threw everything they had at it, which was considerable. They challenged the DNA methodology again in Superior Court and lost. They argued that Richard Harlow's letter was not a legally binding acknowledgement and were correct. But the letter, combined with the DNA evidence and the 20 years of documented payments, constituted what the court found to be a clear pattern of recognition and support. Thomas argued with meticulous documentation that Richard Harlow had privately and consistently treated his obligation to me as parental in nature. There were depositions. Margaret Harlow's was 3 hours long. She was composed throughout, and I was not in the room for it. Thomas handled it. But he told me afterward that she'd confirmed, under oath, that she had been aware of my existence since 1992, 14 years into my life, when she had discovered correspondence between Richard and her family attorney about the anonymous payment arrangement. She had known. For 30 years, she had known, and she had chosen silence. I didn't feel anger about that exactly. I felt something more complex, a kind of grief for all of us, for the web of choices and silences that had shaped every life in this story. But grief was not going to change the outcome I was fighting for. Derek's deposition was different. He was, according to Thomas, aggressive in the early portion, and then, as the questioning moved through the timeline of events following his father's death, increasingly defensive and, at moments, evasive. When Thomas asked him directly who had written the index card delivered to my mailbox on March 12th of the previous year, Derek invoked his Fifth Amendment right not to self-incriminate, which told us everything we needed to know. He had sent it, not to help me, to provoke me into action so he could identify and contain the threat before the estate was settled. He had gambled that I would either be frightened off or would surface as a claimant he could then pay off cheaply. He had miscalculated. In September, Judge Souza issued her ruling in the probate proceedings. I was found to be a biological heir of Richard James Harlow. The estate, valued at $43 million, was to be distributed according to Connecticut intestacy law as it applied to acknowledged non-marital children. My share, 1/3, after debts and taxes and legal fees, was approximately $11 million. I sat in Thomas's office when he told me and stared at the far wall for a long time. "There's one more thing," Thomas said. The ethics board reviewed the recording. Garvey received a formal censure. Derek Harlow has been referred to the state attorney's office on a separate matter. The individual who delivered the intimidating letter to your home has cooperated with investigators and confirmed she acted on Derek's direct instruction. That's a potential civil harassment charge, possibly criminal depending on how the AG's office proceeds. Is Margaret part of that? No evidence she directed any of it. She appears to have been aware but passive. I nodded. That felt right somehow. Not exculpatory, but accurate. The Harlow Development Group's board removed Derek from the CEO position the following week, citing the reputational exposure from the probate proceedings and the ongoing legal investigation. The firm had already lost 2 significant development contracts whose principals had cited the litigation as a concern. I signed the final estate documents on a Friday afternoon in October, exactly 1 year after Richard Harlow had died, writing a letter he never had the chance to send. Thomas poured 2 small glasses of decent whiskey from a bottle in his desk drawer, which I hadn't expected from him. We drank them without ceremony. "You should be proud of how you handled this," he said. "I should have done it sooner," I said. "You did it when you were ready." I drove home through the October dark, the leaves already turning, and sat on my front porch for a long time. The mailbox at the end of the path was visible in the porch light. Just a standard black metal mailbox, the kind you can buy at any hardware store. I had replaced it twice in 20 years. It had held 20 envelopes, each one a secret, each one a kind of apology from a man who didn't know how to be honest, and so was, instead, quietly generous. It had held 1 index card that changed my life. I didn't need anything from that mailbox anymore. The truth had already arrived. The first thing I did with the settlement was nothing, for 60 days. Thomas had advised it. Give the initial shock of the money time to normalize before you make any decisions you'll live with permanently. I took that advice and kept going to work, kept reviewing tax returns and quarterly filings and small business ledgers, kept having coffee with Diane on Tuesday mornings at the bakery on Farmington Avenue. I did not buy anything. I did not tell any of my clients. I did not change my routine in any visible way. What I did do was hire a contractor to finally renovate my kitchen, which I'd been putting off for 6 years because the cost felt irresponsible. I put new countertops in and a proper farmhouse sink and a window that looked out over the backyard, and I stood at that sink every morning with my coffee and allowed myself to feel, quietly and without drama, that I had earned this. In the spring, I expanded my practice to full time and hired a junior associate, a young woman named Priya, who had graduated top of her class at UConn and couldn't find a position because she didn't know the right people, which is how most worthwhile things fail to happen. She was excellent. My client base doubled in 18 months. I established a scholarship fund at the University of Hartford in my mother's name, the Carol Ann Mitchell Scholar Award, for first-generation college students in financial need. The first year, 4 students received it. The second year, 7. I attended both ceremonies and sat in the back and did not introduce myself. I found out through entirely indirect means that the Harlow Development Group had lost 3 more major contracts in the year following the probate proceedings. The firm Richard had built over 40 years had been quietly sold to a Boston-based group for a fraction of its assessed value. Derek negotiated a small retained equity stake. It was not, by any account, enough. He was charged by the state attorney's office with civil harassment in connection with the letter delivered to my home, settled without admitting liability, the way powerful men settle things when they can no longer dictate the terms outright, and paid a civil judgment that was a fraction of what he once stood to inherit. His marriage had ended in divorce proceedings by the following year. Margaret Harlow had sold the family house in Simsbury and moved to an assisted living community in Avon. She had known about me since 1992. She'd made a choice then, and she'd lived with it. And eventually it had come due in the way that deferred debts always do. Diane and I took a trip to Portugal in the fall, Lisbon and the Douro Valley, 10 days, the first real vacation I had taken in 11 years. On the last night, sitting above the dark river with a glass of something crisp and cold, Diane asked whether I thought about Richard. "Sometimes," I said. "I wonder what kind of person he was. Not the money. The money was guilt. I understand that. I wonder whether he was a coward who occasionally felt the pull toward courage, or a coward who occasionally felt the pull toward cruelty and managed to land somewhere in the middle." "That's most people," Diane said. "I know. I don't hate him. I think I might have liked him in another life." I looked out at the river. I'm angry at the system he operated in, the one where the woman keeps the secret and the man keeps his reputation, and the child gets money instead of acknowledgement. I'm angry at that. Not at him specifically, not anymore. "What about Margaret?" "She made choices," I said. "They caught up with her. That's enough." The river was very still below us, the lights of the city reflected in the water. I am not a dramatic person. I am a practical woman who builds things carefully and keeps her accounts in order, and has learned, later in life than I would have liked, that some forms of silence are not protection at all. They are just a different kind of debt, accumulating interest in the dark. I came home from Portugal in October, 2 years almost to the day from when Judge Souza had issued her ruling. My house was waiting for me, the garden gone to seed in the way gardens do when no one is tending them, the maple in the front yard on fire with color. I walked to the mailbox out of habit, the same mailbox, the same path, the same October light. It held a gas bill and a catalog and a card from Diane's daughter, who was now at the University of Vermont and had remembered that I liked receiving mail. No envelope, no index card, nothing I didn't already understand. I went inside and put the kettle on. That is my story. There is nothing noble about staying silent to protect someone else's reputation. There is nothing practical about accepting money in place of truth. And there is nothing that a large enough number can buy from a person who has finally decided to know who she is. What would you have done? Would you have taken the $2 million and walked away? Or would you have needed to know? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. I read everyone. And if you know someone who is carrying a silence they were never asked to carry, share this with them.